Okay, well, it's 6:33. Why don't we go ahead and start? Josh, there's 114 people on here, so it's about a very typical humanities lecture.
Wild, man. I love it.
So it's really, really cool. All right, so I just want to welcome everybody out to our digital humanities lecture series. This is the first time that we've done this. Normally, we would be meeting on a Thursday night at the ASCB building down by the culinary school, where this lecture series has taken place since the end of 2016. So I just want to thank everybody for coming out, a lot of students for dropping in tonight. Before we kind of get started with Dr. Hebert's presentation tonight, a couple of things I just want to, some rules of, digital rules for the presentation. So one thing is it looks like everybody's muted. So if you can continue to mute yourself, that'd be great. We'll leave some room at the end of this for questions. If you would like, please leave a question in the chat and I'll monitor that. I'm assuming Melissa will help me with that as well, and we'll kind of circle back to that so that we can address any questions that you might have about Dr. Hebert's presentation. So aside from that, I will probably have like 20 minutes at the end of that. I know that probably a lot of my students might be anxious that are on this call because I've been talking about this for a while, and so if you have some questions and it has nothing to do with the presentation and you need to chat with me, just stay on until the end, and then we can kind of address those particular questions as well. So I think that's some really good rules. One other thing, I think for most of us, if we could keep the cameras off, not everybody, but for most of us, that way it just kind of helps out with the bandwidth, because that's one of the challenges that we face right now in our digital world. So, okay, so my name is Jerry Wallace. I've been hosting this lecture series since 2016. It all started with Dr. Ken Hammond's Kent State presentation on the Kent State shootings. He's actually coming back for us next month to give a similar presentation on the Kent State shootings. And so we will be here roughly 1 month from today for that presentation as well. And so we'll send out some information for that. So, but this has been going on for about 5 years now, and we've seen a variety of different scholars. And it was I couldn't wait to actually have Dr. Hebert participate in this because he has some very, what I would consider very interesting ideas, because I'm not a medieval historian. I'm very boring. I'm a borderlands historian. So every time I hear Dr. Hebert talk, it's always very fascinating because I usually, I learn so much from these presentations. So very excited to have him participate in this lecture series. And so let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Hebert. Dr. Hebert is a graduate with a PhD from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Go Tar Heels. Too bad they got knocked out of the tournament last week.
We suck again.
He is currently an assistant professor at the El Paso Community College Northwest campus. And I need to go to my notes. Sorry, Josh. I didn't have that all memorized.
Oh, dude, you're good.
And he's currently participating in the UTEP, or the EPCC UTEP Mellon Collaborative, in which his current research is focusing on apocalyptic ideas and rhetoric and conquistador writing about the Americas. And he's here to share that with us tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Josh.
Right on, man. Thank you so much, Jerry. And thanks for the opportunity. This is the second time that I've done the lecture series, and I really enjoyed my first time when I was talking about my dissertation. So now that I've kind of pushed the boat out, as it will, on this new project that I've kind of begun here, it's cool to have an opportunity to share it. And I have to add that this project started because of the lecture series. It was a couple years ago that Liz Hodorovich from Mexico State came down and talked about her AmerAsia project, and I had a question for her, and I couldn't stop thinking about that question after she had a chance to answer it, and we talked for a little bit about it. And so I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna go and I'm gonna go find this out for myself. So that students who have joined us can give you a sense of kind of how history projects start. You just have a question and you follow your, I was about to say, follow your dreams to the end of the historical road, but you follow your instincts and you see where it takes you, and you never know where you're going to end up. You might have an idea, but by the time you actually get to your destination, it's very, very different. So it's also just cool to do history out in public. I think there's kind of a mysterious shroud about what historians do and how we do it, and the sort of things that we're interested in. And you know, it's more than just memorizing dead dudes and putting them on a timeline. And I think that presentations like this, whether it's about the New World and the Apocalypse, it's about hops and beer, it's about Kent State, or whatever, just gives everybody a chance to see how cool our discipline is. So we're awesome. In any case, if you want to see an up close of the PowerPoint, change your view on Zoom to the speaker highlight view instead of the gallery. I have it set up so I have a green screen behind me and my PowerPoint is my background. So we don't have to do anything crazy. I've got it all taken care of. It's rad that way. I figured this out. Hooray, YouTube. All right, so here we go. We all know how this story starts, right? If we were all together in person, I'd make you say the following poem with me. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We'd all gag a little bit, at least on the inside, and we'd have a good snicker about having to do something so silly. And alas, in our virtual world of 2021, this extremely meta joke will have to do. Christopher Columbus, taking these 3 small ships filled with, let's say, undesirables, and heading west, changed the world forever. I think we might be right to say and conclude that Columbus's voyage to the Americas might be the most consequential event in world history. In our history survey classes, we spend considerable amounts of time thinking about the consequences of Columbus's voyage, his encounter with indigenous people, his exploitation and enslavement of those peoples, the waves of disease unleashed by his arrival, and ultimately, the Columbian Exchange, the trade between the Western and Eastern hemispheres. We know this story really, really well. But what we don't know as well are Columbus's religious beliefs. After all, that's not really the sort of thing that we're going to find in our 10th grade world history class. Probably. I mean, I told my former 10th grade students what I'm about to tell you, kind of, but I'm not so sure they were really into it when I did. Christopher Columbus was many things, but perhaps what we could best describe him as is as a crusader. And I mean this entirely in the medieval sense. At the core of his motivations was the holy city of Jerusalem, long held by Muslims, at his time the Ottomans, and for several centuries by this point, the ultimate prize of Latin Christendom, Western Europe, which began efforts to retake it, and briefly did, at the end of the 11th century. To say that the Crusades of the 11th through 15th centuries went well would not be faithful to the historical record, to put it very mildly. After the surprising success of the First Crusade and the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, the remaining crusading efforts rendered failure after failure. That failure culminated in 1291 with the fall of Acre, the last crusader city in the Levant, and crusading changed. In 1453, after the Ottoman Turks captured and occupied Constantinople, the long-standing capital of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire and the center of the Greek Church, crusading took another turn towards the recapture of that city instead of a focus on Jerusalem itself. However, despite the changes the crusading movement faced over the centuries, perhaps one of many constants that ran through the conceiving, preaching, and execution of these armed pilgrimage remained the same. They were apocalyptic events. I mean this in two ways. First, the military actions of the Crusades are scenes from an apocalypse. Though they are certainly exaggerated in places, the chronicles of the Crusades, especially of the First Crusade, are filled with images of violence and gore. At the siege of Jerusalem, at least according to the chronicler Raymond de Aguilera, the streets of the holy city of Jerusalem were littered with the heads and limbs of the dead, and the blood ran so high it came up to the knees of men on horseback. Terrifying. More importantly, for our purposes tonight, the Crusades represented a critical moment in salvation history, a clear sign of the second coming of Jesus Christ, and indeed the end of the world. For Christianity, especially medieval Christian thinkers, history was the unfolding of God's plan from beginning to end. You could calculate, theoretically, when the earth began, and people did. You could theoretically calculate when it would end, and people did. And during the Middle Ages, especially during the Middle Ages, the Crusades were a symbol of that impending end of everything. It is in this second context into which we'll be situating Columbus tonight. He is that sort of apocalyptic thinker. He is that sort of apocalyptic crusader. But more than Columbus, my goal here tonight is to really introduce you to the research that I and my wonderful assistant who is on this call tonight, Jordan Wright, have been doing over the past year. And it's some rather cool stuff about this connection between the Christian apocalypse and the European discovery of the New World. So that's our agenda, but let's back up just a little bit. Before we really dive in and do some, I'm so sorry, discovering, let me map out precisely what we're going to discuss and get a few terms on the table. We'll just get comfortable. I don't know, as comfortable as we can be. Here's how we'll proceed. We're going to talk about the shape of the Christian apocalypse. We'll talk about a few key texts, some critical ideas that developed during the Middle Ages. Then we'll turn to good old Christopher Columbus and how he applied those ideas in his book of Profecias, and how a couple of other writers, namely Geronimo de Mendieta and Toribio de Motolinia, also used the language of the apocalypse or scenes from the apocalypse to try and make sense of the New World. And then I'll end with a few closing remarks about where we could go. I'll also admit, right here at the beginning of all things, that things are a bit preliminary. There are lots of things left to explore. And that's hopefully the last exploration pun that I will make this evening. I'm so sorry. It won't be, but you can hope. So let's start with the language of the apocalypse. For most of us, at least in the Western world, we feel fairly confident in our knowledge of what the Christian end times looks like. Many of us are likely familiar with its pull in American pop culture, ranging from books like the much older Late Great Planet Earth, written by Hal Lindsey in 1970, or the even more recent Left Behind movies, or novels, now movies, written by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. These came out in the late 90s and early 2000s. I read all of them. I was a fanatic. And they've actually made a couple of movies out of these books, including one starring Nicolas Cage. It's terrible, but that's exactly why you should watch it. Also bizarre, right around the turn of the millennium, Arnold Schwarzenegger fought the devil in a movie called End of Days. It was great. Arnold versus the devil, guys, like, come on. Netflix tonight. Well, most of our pop culture iconography, at least around the apocalypse, centers on the last book of the Christian Bible, Revelation, or as it was first rendered in the Greek, apocalypsis, taken here to mean unveiling or revealing. What was unveiled to the book's author, John of Patmos, were scenes of the last days of the earth, a time of great trouble, earthquakes, violence, meteors, rivers of blood, and other horrors. There were some locusts and all of these great calamities, of course, preceded the arrival of Jesus back to earth and the establishment of his 1,000-year-long reign before the unbinding of Satan and the final destruction of the world. It's just absolutely metal stuff here. I think, however, it's more helpful for us to think of the Christian apocalypse as more of an ecosystem of texts instead of just relying on the one that sits at the end of the New Testament. Indeed, in order to understand the complexities of the Christian apocalypse, one must do as those in late antiquity and the medieval worlds did. Read the other books of the Bible and look for clues. After all, there were clues to be found. Though Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew told his disciples that nobody but God the Father knew precisely when the end would come, according to Luke the Evangelist, Jesus proclaimed that there would be signs and a great tribulation. Moreover, the prophecies of the prophet Daniel in the Jewish Bible would play a key role in the unveiling of the world. As such, medieval theologians read not just Revelation to understand the signs for which to be on the lookout, but this whole body of Jewish and Christian scripture in order to contemplate the end. Of course, if you're thinking, wait, didn't Jesus say that nobody knows except for the Father? I totally get where you're coming from. But that hasn't stopped men and women over the course of the last 2 millennium from trying to predict it anyway. I mean, those dudes are still around, and a lot of people take them very, very seriously. Now, I don't want to get bogged down in the apocalypticism of early Christianity for time's sake, but let's summarize by saying it was ever present. Certainly, the Apostle Paul writes with an apocalyptic fervor. He's very excited about this. He thinks Jesus is coming any single day, and he thinks it's coming soon. Many other early Christian fathers follow exactly the same lead. Notably, the most important and influential of the early church fathers, Eusebius and Augustine of Hippo, were staunchly opposed to predicting the end, but left an interpretive framework for salvation history that lent itself to the search for signs of this impending doom. Key to the understanding of history in this apocalyptic vein lies in the Old Testament book of Daniel, specifically the story of when Daniel interprets the dream of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, affectionately known to me as Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's dream involved a statue made out of several materials. He had a head of gold, a chest and arms made from silver, a torso and thighs made of bronze, legs of iron, and the feet were made of clay. Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that this statue represented the various ages of the entire earth, and that each segment of the statue stood for a great empire that would rise and fall before finally God brought the last empire to dust and established his own kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian empire, according to Daniel, was represented by the gold head, and his successors would be revealed in time. For the Christian church fathers, this provided the framework for understanding these various ages of the world that would transpire before the arrival of Jesus. And it was this framework that allowed the era of apocalypticism to continue, despite big theological names like Eusebius and Augustine of Hippo saying, don't do this. And so where the early church fathers go, so did medieval theologians. In general, the apocalyptic imagination of these end times enthusiasts did not stray far from their forebears. They did, however, develop a few innovations that took root in medieval theology and prophecy over the course of several centuries. Perhaps the most important of these innovations was the concept of the last world emperor, a Christian monarch that would lead the forces of Christ against the forces of evil in one last battle that would bring a lasting peace to the world before the end of time. The story of the last world emperor comes from a Byzantine author writing in the name of the 4th century martyr Methodius. The text, however, was not written down until the mid-7th century, so right around 650. And as a result, because this dude is writing in a name that isn't his real name, we call this guy Pseudo-Methodius. He's not really Methodius, but he's saying he is. One of the many important contexts of the Pseudo-Methodius text is that its production aligns in timing with the rise of Islam. Given the rapidity of the Arab conquests at the end of the 7th century, it's no wonder this text gained so much traction. The spread of Islamic armies clearly seemed to resonate as a world-ending event for those in the region, especially those who were living in the Byzantine Empire. Now, if you're familiar with Revelation, that last book of the New Testament, you might remember that towards the end of John's vision, Satan is released from his prison and gathers an army from the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and this army fights a final battle against the forces of Christ in the fields of Megiddo, or Armageddon. This is the Battle of Armageddon itself. This is not the Michael Bay-led Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck vehicle of the early 2000s. Great movie. Sort of, I guess. Here's where things go off the beaten path a little bit, and I promise that this is all coming back to Columbus and the New World. Pseudo-Methodius, even though he is not the first to do so, combined the story of the last world emperor with a legend about the famous Hellenistic empire builder, Alexander the Great. The story goes that as Alexander was conquering the lands of West and Central Asia, he received a command from God. Yes, the God of the Bible. So this is some serious retconning. If you're, sorry, Siri, if you're keeping track of a timeline here, Alexander existed well before Christ did. So this would be something rather remarkable. In any case, God himself moves Alexander to drive these enemies of his that he finds in Asia into a space in the north between these 2 mountains. And then God himself moved these mountains closer, and Alexander constructed large bronze gates to hold them all in all, Alexander bound 22 nations behind these great northern gates, which would hold until the last of the days. These were the armies that the last world emperor would do battle with at Armageddon. He would win, retake Jerusalem, Antichrist would appear, and would ultimately hand the last world emperor would hand his crown over to God so that God could secure a final victory over Antichrist himself. Christopher Columbus, to come back to good old Chrissy boy, he knew these stories. While he did not quote Pseudo-Methodius directly, the story of the last world emperor permeated his thinking. Columbus was a man who, despite what we think of him, and he's not a great dude, he was well versed in the late medieval theology of the Latin Church, the Catholic Church, and he knew prophecy. And nowhere is this clearer than in his Book of Prophecies, a collection of prophetic texts, both from the Bible and outside the Bible, that Columbus collected as proof of the correctness of his apocalyptic worldview. Scholars have done a lot of work on Columbus's Book of Prophecies and his worldview. We know, for example, that Columbus commissioned this manuscript sometime between 1500 and 1503, toward the end of his career and during his fourth voyage. While Columbus gave the instructions for the compiling of these texts in the Book of Prophecies, it was a Carthusian monk named Gaspar Gorriccio who actually compiled the volume and put it all together. He made the book. In a letter that Columbus sent to Gorriccio around 1501, Columbus explained that he had been collecting prophetic texts for a number of years, but no longer had the time to pursue the project. He asked Gorriccio to finish the job. And the book itself is a number of proof texts. It contains passages from the Psalms, the Hebrew prophets, the New Testament, a few references to New Testament Apocrypha. It has quotes from St. Augustine of Hippo, Isidore of Seville, another important medieval theologian, and, importantly, the University of Paris theologian Pierre de Ailly. We're going to talk about de Ailly in a minute. He's one of the navigation tools on our journey here. There's another exploration pun. You're welcome. At the front of the Book of Prophecies, Columbus attached a couple of letters that he wrote to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, outlining his apocalyptic ideology that colored his understanding of the voyages he took to what he was convinced was Asia. He told the Spanish monarchs that he had learned so much from his voyages around the world and had also taken the time to collect and study numerous works of cosmography, astrology, history, prophecy, alchemy, and all kinds of things. It was his study of these disciplines that provided him with the knowledge he used to chart a course for the Indies and deliver on the promises that he made to the monarchs. Throughout his letter to the Spanish monarchs, Columbus continued to justify his position and his rightness through a connection to biblical prophecy, claiming that his accomplishments fulfilled several of the prophecies of both the Old and New Testaments. In particular, he was pretty excited that he was spreading the gospel to all peoples of the earth and potentially providing a means to recapture the Holy Temple, the Temple of Solomon in the holy city of Jerusalem. These were both signs of the impending return of Jesus. Columbus concluded his letter by laying out a general timeline for what he thought was good math for calculating the arrival of the end of time, charting through various Christian theologians, again, including Isidore of Seville, St. Augustine, and Pierre de Ailly. He concluded his letters by referencing a few prophecies to come. That the one to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem would come from Spain. Now, where he got this from is interesting. Columbus says that he got it from the Calabrian abbot Joachim of Fiore, who wrote in the 13th century. And Fiore says a lot of these things. He doesn't pinpoint the person to recapture Jerusalem from Spain. It turns out that Columbus got it from somebody else. Another theologian, thinker, a guy named Arnal de Villanova. But I'm getting aside myself, and I promised I wouldn't do that. So, all right. In any case, so he gets it from these medieval theologians, and then he also thinks, because he's read Pierre de Ailly, that Islam surging in the middle of the 15th century, the capture of Constantinople, is another one of these signs of the impending end. So Columbus would write the king and queen of Spain a second letter a few years later, 1503. It doesn't appear in the book of Profecias, but it carries many of the same themes. Marooned off the coast of Jamaica, Columbus wrote of some of his recent misfortunes before turning towards the prophetic once again. His misfortune was, number one, he had been taken back to Spain as a prisoner in chains because he was a jerk and a murderer and everything else. And then secondly, he had gotten shipwrecked. What are you going to do, Columbus? Columbus wrote about his journey to Veragua. And here's a map of this fourth voyage. It's down here. I don't know if you can see my my pointer, but we're talking down here, this bridge between North and Central and South America. This is, along the Caribbean coasts of Nicaragua, Puerto Rico, Panama, and Columbus discussed all of the gold that he had found. And he said that it was 4 times the amount of gold that he had found up here in Hispaniola, where he had first explored. He's clearly smitten. But then Columbus wrote something curious. He returned to his biblical knowledge and wrote about the gold that Solomon found during his expeditions into Arabia. I mean, this is Old Testament stuff, okay? Solomon goes out, he finds all of this gold, he brings this gold back. This is what funds the temple. You can find this story in the book of Chronicles, the book of Kings, the Roman historian Josephus. And Columbus was convinced that these gold fields in Veragua were the same such fields from which Solomon had taken his gold to build the temple. So to Columbus, this was prima facie evidence of the truth of the prophecies that he so fervently believed in. This gold could provide the means by which somebody could fulfill the prophecy that a man from Spain would rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This was the gold that would allow him to do it. So to recap where we've been so far, Columbus has both blended biblical and extra-biblical apocalyptic prophecy with a little bit of biblical geography in order to add meaning to the voyages that he took. He's understanding the new world in terms of this apocalypse. And I will fully admit that we are scratching the surface here. Columbus's mind is filled with all sorts of interesting bits of theology, philosophy, alchemy, astrology. The dude loved astrology. Like, and I'm not talking about like go to the newspaper and read your horoscope for the day astrology. I mean, he's talking hardcore prediction. He loved Saturn. Like Saturn was his planet, man. I haven't figured out what exactly that's about, but he loved Saturn. So does my brother, oddly. Anyway, they have nothing to do with each other. In any case. But what I want to emphasize is I want to emphasize that Columbus's reason for being, the reason behind his voyage, is a way to fund a final crusade to Jerusalem to defeat Islam once and for all. And based on his knowledge of prophecy, he sincerely believed that the Spanish monarchs would be the ones to accomplish this final victory. In other words, Columbus saw Ferdinand and Isabella at the end of the finally earthly kingdom that would usher in the end of days as foretold in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. They were, in Columbus's mind at least, the last world emperor. Now, I imagine that a lot of this seems really weird and so far beyond the standard knowledge about Columbus and medieval thinking about the world in general. But I want to briefly make the case that Columbus's understanding of prophecy and geography were not too far outside the norm for many late medieval European theologians. As we've talked about already, Columbus had more than a passing familiarity with a large body of medieval knowledge. He had taken particular interest in the University of Paris theologian Pierre de Ailly. There he is. Who, among other things, he had written several works on geography, alchemy, and astrology. I want to focus mostly on the geography here, since that's what's going to be helpful for us tonight. But there's been some really interesting work done on his views of alchemy and astrology that I'd be happy to recommend. Columbus thought that this was all pretty interesting too. Columbus's letters are full of interesting insights and references to medieval astrology, again, especially about Saturn. And Columbus, and indeed the general medieval knowledge, sorry, my thing is on the wrong part of the computer. Columbus and indeed the general medieval knowledge of the Earth's geography came from an intellectual and theological tradition, as well as a genre of late medieval travel writing. We focused a lot on the theological tradition, so let's talk about travel writing for just a bit. Starting in the 13th century, Western Europeans began to make semi-regular journeys from Europe to Asia. We're probably all familiar with this guy, Marco Polo, but he's not the only one. In addition to merchants like Polo, the Polos, I should say, several friars from both the Dominican and the Franciscan orders traveled across Asia. They met with the Mongol Khans. Sometimes they got killed by the Mongols. At least that's the tradition. And there's these great stories of their martyrdoms. Please see my episode on footnoting history about that. Part and parcel of these descriptions of the East was an attempt to locate certain biblical markers. So as they're traveling, these guys are writing down things, usually not while they're traveling, usually when they get to where they're going, or they come back, or they just imagine themselves traveling to the East, and they write down what they think would be out there, or what they think they saw out there. My favorite example is this Franciscan guy named Odoric of Pordenone, and he has thoughts about India, and he writes about how he knows for beyond a shadow of a doubt that women from India are the most beautiful in the world. Like a Franciscan friar, this like celibate dude takes time out of his day to be like, man, they're hot. They're hot. Got to get on that. Anyway, so this genre, this Marvels of the East genre, people start to want to locate these biblical places. And they want to find places like the Mines of Solomon. They want to find the Garden of Eden. They want to find all kinds of things. Some of this tradition leaked into the late medieval geographies written by Latin Christians like Pierre de Ailly. In his treatise, for example, de Ailly puts significant emphasis on India. He places India on such a pedestal that he's actually willing to displace Jerusalem and the Garden of Eden in terms of importance. I think that's fairly interesting. In any case, the East becomes a place where medieval Christians can imagine so much. They can find not only themselves out there and a primitive version of the church, they can find these places that they thought had been lost. It's just full of mythic potential. But we have to ask, what does the Garden of Eden and these lost places of sacred geography have to do with the end of the world? Our answer is twofold. First, finding the terrestrial paradise, the Garden of Eden, was one of the many signs of the coming end. And indeed, during the later part of the Middle Ages, crusaders and travelers alike searched for the garden's location. Again, in Asia. Of course, nobody ever found the garden during this time, so it stood to reason that it still existed out there somewhere. And indeed, many map makers of the time placed the garden somewhere on their maps. So let me show you one. Here's one from 1430. This is called the Borgia map. And if you're going, that doesn't look like the Earth, well, hold on a second. Number one, I want to point out that it's round. Nobody thought that the world was flat. Kyrie Irving. Thank you. Anyway, here's Africa up here at the north. Europe is down over here. Over on the left is Asia. And if you see the arrow, it's pointing to the Garden of Eden. It's all walled off. There's some angel with a flaming sword around here somewhere, guarding, like Genesis says. Right here, that's the gates of Alexander. That's where the armies of Gog and Magog are held up. Okay, so that apocalyptic geography is right here, even before Columbus comes on the scene. And this isn't the only one. I just thought it was the coolest one. In any case, a second way that the location of the Garden of Eden was apocalyptic lies in the fact that locating it reveals tangible proof of God's plan. Here, like the Holy Sepulchre, Golgotha, and other such holy sites, was a clear, demonstrative symbol of the Christian faith. And that's exactly what an apocalypse is when it comes down to it. An unveiling of previously secret knowledge. Truthfully, that makes every act of discovery, at least in this medieval sense, apocalyptic. In any case, Columbus on his third voyage, so this is before the Book of Prophecy, believed that he was on the verge of finding the Garden of Eden. He had sailed through the greater Antilles, the island of Trinidad, and he ended up down around here at the mouth of the Orinoco River. Columbus believed that the garden had to be nearby. He was taken in by the amount of fresh water pouring into the Atlantic from the Orinoco and concluded that this had to be a sign. Water that fresh could not come from a normal river. It had to come from a river flowing out of the earthly paradise. However, he believed that the garden was still unapproachable, though his imagination doesn't really match up with ours. He believed, Columbus did, that because of the way that the wind blew and the water flowed in this part below the equator, he was very confused by this, that he had found evidence of a fourth continent, not the Americas, okay? He still thought he was in Asia, but he thought that there was this like little mini continent on which the mountain of purgatory sat, and then the Garden of Eden was on the top of purgatory. He read his Dante. Now, I want to be really clear here one more time and say that he's not fully understanding that he's found North and South America. He believed that again, that this continent was tiny, little small continent. Curiously, and let me address this since I threw Kyrie Irving under the bus a minute ago. Many people wrongly believe that Columbus discovered that the earth was round. No. Everybody knew that the world was round. Everybody did. The Greeks knew it. The Romans knew it. Everybody in the Middle Ages knew it. There was no debate on this. What there was debate on was how big was the earth, and it was round, but was it a perfect sphere? Columbus did not believe it was a perfect sphere. He thought it was pear-shaped. And because he's Columbus, he actually described it as a breast, like a boobie. And he was like, oh, the Garden of Eden and Mount Purgatory, that's a nipple. Because reasons. Anyway, I bet he had mommy issues. Columbus, going off of this newfound evidence, of course, believes that the earth is round, blah, blah, blah. So before we move on to another brief view of the New World as this kind of key apocalyptic area, we have to say here that Columbus and his motivations go beyond that old paradigm of the 3 G's that we learn in high school: gold, God, and glory. Columbus's motivations are necessarily apocalyptic. Yes, there's gold, God, and glory, but the context of those 3 G's needs to be understood with this apocalyptic rhetoric. So before we end, and I realize we are spiraling towards 7:30 really quickly, so I won't rush, but I'm editing as I go here a little. I want to talk about 2 other guys. The first guy I want to talk about is a Franciscan friar named Geronimo de Mendieta, whose focus doesn't rest really on the location of gold to fund a crusading project, but he's really focused on the conversion aspect of things. Mendieta arrives in the New World in 1554, and as many Franciscans did, he immediately took to the work of converting the native peoples he encountered. We're going to take a look at his record of this, the Historia Ecclesiastica Indiana, the history of the Indian Church, and he's up to a couple things here. He wants to explain some new information. He wants to know who these Native Americans are. What is their relationship to biblical history? Because if the Bible lays out the entire scope of the history of the world based on God's creation, these people have to be in it somewhere. They would have to be. So the solution that this isn't Mendieta's original solution. He's tapping into a tradition here. The tradition that started to develop was that these Native Americans that we know that have nothing to do with the Hebrew Bible. Okay, well, if you're Mormon, that's not true, but fair enough. What they believed at this time, these Spanish dudes, these Franciscans, was that the Native Americans were the lost tribes of Israel that were mentioned in the New Testament, especially around the end times. They would be a part of this wide-scale conversion of Jews right before the end of it. Now, not everybody believed this. There were some dissenting voices against this view, but Mendieta really bought into this. And he even went so far as to describe the conquest of the Aztecs in biblical terms. Mendieta described Hernan Cortez as a new Moses, leading the Aztec people out of their spiritual bondage from the devil as Moses led the Israelites out of Pharaoh's bondage. Mendieta's vision would influence a couple of later people. They'd make some interesting twists on it, but this is where it starts. Perhaps the most interesting thing, at least to me, that Mendieta added about Cortez was the story of how the conquistador welcomed the arrival of 12 Franciscan friars to Tenochtitlan. The arrival of these friars, and there's Cortez's mug. Here's the slide I meant on. The arrival of these friars was the official kickoff of the attempt to convert those who had fallen under Cortez's sway. This was going to be the moment that the conversion of the end starts. The arrival of these 12 friars has obvious apocalyptic tones, even from the number of them that arrive, 12, which mirrors that of Christ's apostles. Even their send-off back in Europe was full of ceremony and liturgy, like the processions of the church that have very apocalyptic meaning. In any event, Cortez, according to Mendieta's story, went out to meet the friars, knelt before them, and kissed their hands. He's bowing, recognizing their holiness. In a later telling, it goes further. Cortez removes his cape and places it on the ground for the friars to walk on. This is a part of the drama of the Catholic liturgy, the Mass. It's a specifically religious ceremony. And what's interesting is it's mirroring the arrival of Christ into Jerusalem. So again, we have that imagery of Christ returning. Again, apocalyptic. Mendieta would later revise his things, at least about who the indigenous people of America were. He actually thought that they were an entirely different species of human beings altogether. A perfected human being, but perfected in terms of they were free from greed and violence and all of these other things. And that, you know, they didn't need to be priests, for example, and they didn't have to participate in this, that, or the third. It's fascinating. So, I'm skipping ahead here. Mendieta's working towards the building of the kingdom of God on the face of the earth. And for some, this is a precondition for Christ's return. Because the natives had this inborn perfection and innocence that the men of the old world did not, Mendieta believed that this was a chance for Christianity to be perfected. In the words of James Phelan, this gave Mendieta the opportunity again to perfect the Christianity of the old world in the new world. This was not to be. Mendieta would not be successful, but there's clear apocalyptic motivation. Finally, and briefly, I want to talk about this dude, Motolinia, one of those 12 friars who first arrived in Tenochtitlan. He describes a scene in his history of New Spain, in which the natives of Tlaxcalan staged a play that enacted the final conquest of Jerusalem, led by the Spanish. And we're getting real close to the end here. I'm going to summarize this quickly. The play included a construction of Jerusalem on top of some local houses, a full parade of the Eucharist, and the battle for Jerusalem itself. Joining the Spanish, played by the natives, were others, Galileans, Judeans, Syrians, Samaritans, all coming to the aid of those who wished to defeat the Moors, the Muslims, and drive them from Jerusalem. Also joining the battle was the army of New Spain, full of natives from the Americas who had come to help the Spanish secure this final victory against Islam. Eventually, armies of Spanish and from New Spain are joined by other European forces, including the King of France and the King of Hungary, both who bow to the Spanish monarch. Now, this is a play, but think about the imagery. I'm guessing that some of you might be going, where's England? Isn't England important? Where's Germany? Aren't they in Western Europe? There's no use wasting time on Protestants for Spanish Catholics, folks. Come on. In any event, the forces of Christianity emerged victorious after a few early losses and a recommitment to prayer. And in the wake of their victory, the Sultan of Jerusalem, head of the Muslim forces, recognized the sanctity of the Spanish king, bowed to him, confessed his wrongdoing. Then the Spanish king brought the Sultan and his forces in front of the Pope, who was there, apparently, and the people cried out that they should be baptized. And baptized they were. Now, I hope your jaw is on the floor, because the first time I read this, I was like, oh my God, it couldn't be clearer. Talk about Catholic wish fulfillment. Not only do you have the conquest of Jerusalem once and for all, but the conversion of the Muslim occupiers of the holy city. And led by the forces of New Spain, these indigenous Americans who have come over to join in the cause to bring about this apocalyptic event. It's bursting with apocalyptic imagery. It probably didn't happen. Let's be really clear about this. This is Motolinia being like, I'm gonna write some really awesome fanfic and we're gonna see what happens. But it's instructive. It tells us what Motolinia was thinking about the new. He sees this as this opportunity to bring all of these people together and to recapture Jerusalem once and for all. And that's where I want to leave us tonight. The European arrival to the Americas was an apocalyptic event, both in terms of the drastic changes and violence brought by the Spanish's arrival in the Western Hemisphere and the reconfiguring of prophetic, geographic, and theological knowledge about the world. For Columbus, his voyages to the Americas, even though he believed all the way into his death that he had found India, represented the opportunity to usher in and see proven true the prophecies that he so fervently believed. The New World was also an opportunity to locate some of the places that travelers in the Middle Ages could not find in Asia. It left the door open that these places not only could be found, but they would be found, and Christ would return. And finally, the New World presented missionaries the opportunity to convert the peoples of the Americas in a bid to spread the gospel to all corners of the earth, and even to establish the kingdom of God on earth. So in closing, we must be alive to these religious interpretations of the meaning of discovery in the New World if we are to understand the completely apocalyptic events that took place so close to our home. It is in this place, the place we live now, as the scholar James Phelan articulated so well, that the Middle Ages had their swan song: prophecy, crusading, apocalypse, and all. So, thank you very much for listening to me for the past hour. I'm happy to try to answer whatever questions I can.
Thank you, Josh. That was awesome. Okay, so Dr. Herodovich has a question for you.
I'm so excited for this.
Great. Hi, Josh. Thanks so much for your talk. I just want to make sure you can hear me.
Yes, absolutely.
Let me turn my volume up just a little bit. I think you're really onto something with this research. I think it's something that hasn't really been paid a lot of attention to or not enough attention to. And I want to draw attention to some things and read a couple of quick quotes, and we can email about some sources that I think might be of interest to you. But I think it might be useful for you or interesting to you to pay attention to sort of the Greek meaning of the word apocalypse, which means sort of uncovering.
Yes.
So I don't think that it's an accident that at the same time that the uncovering of the world's populations became available to Europeans, that's a very Eurocentric version of the story. And obviously there's much more about encounters, but if we're thinking about it and we're naming it as coming from a Western perspective, at the same time that you have the uncovering of the world's populations, it kind of makes a certain like synergistic sense that people might be thinking about the uncovering of God's meaning or God's intentions, so that it's sort of maybe natural or makes sense that this is an apocalyptic moment. And I think it's interesting that other explorers or travelers noted the connection between the new peoples that they were seeing in the New World and the apocalypse. So I'm just going to read from some notes here. Vespucci says, in his Mundus Novus, he said, when he talks about all of the inhabitants of the lands he was exploring and this sort of teeming populations, he says, we found in those regions such a multitude of people as nobody could number, as we read in the Apocalypse, a people, I say, gentle and amenable. And another source that comes to mind for me is that there was this fairly well-known Roman theologian at the time named Egidio da Viterbo, who in the early 16th century, you don't have to write this down, we can email about this.
Yes, please.
In the early 16th century, he said, all secrets will be revealed, those of the divine and eternal world through the Kabbalah, and those of the creative world by voyages of discovery. Mankind will be brought into an intellectual and religious unity under this papacy. He goes on later to say that where the apostles had only conquered the smallest part of the world, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, was going to prepare to conquer its entirety. So there are just kind of connections all over the place. And I have an article that I can recommend to you that talks about the way that in Bologna in particular, Bologna in the 1520s was kind of a hotbed for thinking about what did this mean for apocalyptic history, these new lands? And as you were saying, how do they fit into biblical history? Who are these people? Are they Asian, or are they actually the sons of Japheth or the sons of Shem? All those questions. So anyway, we can email about some of those things. But I guess my question is, what's the end of this story? Like, how does this story end? Does the story end when European chroniclers or travelers understand that these aren't Asians or these aren't the sons of Noah? Does it end with like manifest destiny and people going to the West? Like, what's the end of the story? Because this story has to be in motion or changing over time. So how would you end this article, I guess is my question.
Yeah, so I think I would end it in a couple different ways, and a couple of scholars have done this already. And there's an obvious Protestant context that's missing here. You can go to Puritan New England, for example, and I think that there's an apocalypticism of John Winthrop and the like, especially the Puritan dealing with Native Americans, that rings true in kind of this long-standing notion of like the bon sauvage and that sort of thing. In the Spanish context, my gut feeling, and I haven't gotten there yet, is that after Isabella and Ferdinand and Charles V, Philip II doesn't seem to care. In fact, in Phelan's book, he talks about the age of Philip II. Mendieta thought it was like the silver age of the church. It was this kind of a time where the Indian church absolutely collapses. That his apocalyptic schemes for conversion and perfection just absolutely collapse. And I also wonder if the waning of the Spanish Empire brings a lot with that too, because we don't I would imagine that in the English context, the French context, the German context, the Dutch context, that the same sort of crusading spirit fomented by the Reconquista and that very specific Spanish context, at least it seems from this medievalist perspective, doesn't seem to go there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it seems like the end of your story could be sort of the decline of the Spanish Empire that's associated with inflation in Europe at the end of the 16th century, and the
Mhm.
rise of the Protestant merchant Northern Atlantic world that doesn't care about this. I think that could maybe be a real nice conclusion to your story at some point. We can
Yeah.
talk about it in the future, but
Yeah.
thanks so much for your talk. I really
Well,
enjoyed it.
thank you. You helped inspire this, so thank you.
I'm so that's great.
Okay, awesome. That was great. So it looks like Noel, I don't know if it's Noel or Noel has a question as well. But one thing I'm just curious, I want to follow up on something that Liz said. If could the end of the story be actually with the forming of the Mexican Empire or the Mexican Republic, and the fact that they expel pretty much all of these entrenched Catholic, Jesuits and priests, and so would that be a good like sort of endpoint? Yeah, I'm way out of my element here, but I
Yeah,
know
no, I
that.
think that's a really good question. And I think if you were telling the story from the indigenous point of view, that's how you wrap the story. And I think you could tell it as a story of a different kind of apocalypse, a retaking of agency and um, a command of one's own destiny. From the European perspective, though, I think you have to tell the story because they would see it that way.
Okay. Noel or Noel, correct me. I'm not sure exactly.
I think he's typing.
Yeah, so he typed in the chat, did Europeans just get the whole Bible mixed up and confused? Is what he asked.
That is an interesting question, Noel. I really appreciate that one. It's tough to say. And I think that answer depends on who you are. Because if you are a Latin Christian from the 15th or 16th century, the answer is no. We did not get the Bible mixed up. We are relying on this grand tradition of theology and understanding of the natural sciences and all of this, all the way back to, they would go back to Plato, even if we know a little bit better, but going through people like St. Augustine and St. Aquinas and Roger Bacon and Newton and everybody else, it's like, even though those guys are late. And they would say, no, we don't have the Bible mixed up. We just have this very clearly and logically laid out proof of our interpretation of the Bible. Whereas a Protestant, like Martin Luther, is going to take a look at that and go, nah, you're wrong. Here's why you're wrong. I have 95 reasons, and I'm going to nail it to a church door. So, I mean, we can look at this from 2021, and we can say they've actually absolutely twisted all of this up, but we have to unpack our own assumption there and say, where am I coming from? And if I'm seeing this as twisted and messed up, what assumptions am I making about the biblical record itself, if that makes sense?
So we have another question in the chat. I believe Guter. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I'm using my German skills here. So would the apparition of the Virgin of Guadalupe add up to the apocalyptic view of the New World because of Revelation 12?
That's a good question. Hold on. Need a Bible? And my mom's probably going, yeah, you probably do for a number of reasons. All right. So we're talking like the woman and the dragon story. That's Revelation 12. Maybe. I don't know. I tell you what, man, that's a great research question. And you could maybe see it that way. Again, I would say that it's probably dependent on how you're reading woman is. And I'm not sure I have an answer to that question. Sorry, I couldn't help on that one.
It looks like Freddie Hymas has a question as well.
Awesome.
So hi, hello.
What's up, Freddie?
Thank you, thank you, Josh, for the presentation. It was really nice, extremely interesting. I just wanted to ask you if you could, and I think that this is linked a little bit with the previous question, not the last one, the previous one. I just was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how the understandings, for example, of astrology and the interpretation of the Bible and the symbolism that you were mentioning about the purgatory. We tend to think about astrology, at least in the Catholic world, as not part of the dogma. And all of that reminds me a lot of The Body of the Conquistador, which was basically a book that, if I remember correctly, was mostly arguing that in the New World, right? There was this conception of how food and astrology were part of, or came with this understanding of the superiority of the race of Europeans, and came with a lot of issues of maintaining the purity of blood and so on. So I just was wondering, I don't know, I probably went super long, but the idea is, how did astrology and religious dogma played and kind of complemented each other? Can you explain a little bit, because it doesn't seem for a Catholic today a very easy thing to understand.
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is that I had the same question when I started encountering talk about astrology, because, from my perspective, astrology and Christianity don't go together. However, during the Middle Ages, that was not the case. Astrology and Christianity were together. And before astronomy became a thing, astrology was the way that medieval Europeans understood the stars. And they read things in the stars, and they could understand things that were about to happen, predictions, those sorts of things, kind of like we use astrology now. I know that Pierre de Ailly, who I've mentioned a couple times, he's a major theologian at the University of Paris in the 14th century, was a big-time astrologer. Now, the nature of his astrology, what he does, how it works, every time I got to a part in that book, I was just like, I don't know what he's talking about. And speaking of just like, I don't know, coincidence and there's a word that I'm looking for that I can't think of right now. A couple weeks ago, the University of Tennessee had a symposium on the apocalypse, and it just so happens that somebody who wrote about Pierre de Ailly and his astrology was there and talked a little bit about it. And I had a lot of questions that we didn't get a chance to talk about. So she and I, she's at the University of Rochester, we're going to talk next month. And if I understand anything after that conversation, I am happy to report back. But I've got to read her book first. And there's this other book called The Alchemy of Conquest that was really helpful for me thinking through some of these things. It's like 600 pages long. And when Ralph Bauer, the author, starts talking about astrology, I'm just like, I don't know how to read it. It's just, it's so dense. It's going to take me a while to unpack it.
Well, please let me know when you get to read it.
Absolutely.
I'll be happy to
yeah,
do a little bit.
I may need a few beers before I completely understand it, to be completely honest.
All right. Well, I'll have scotch.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Very nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Freddie. Erin is right. I was looking for the word serendipity. She's always. Erin has a question.
Erin has a question. Yeah.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
So this is probably a very simplistic question, but I am also not a medievalist, so take that for what it is.
Yes.
You mentioned that when, I'm sorry, I've gotten all the people mixed up. It's been
It's okay. I do that too.
When I can picture the slide, and this is really bothering me. When he got to the Americas and discovered the indigenous people, and was going through the period where he was thinking that these were the lost tribes of Israel and all of that.
Yes, that's Mendieta.
Yes, that's right. I would have gotten there eventually. I could picture the slide, but not the writing. And he was thinking that they could have been practicing like a purer version of Christianity. Why? I guess I'm trying to formulate the question, but if he thought they had this pure society and this pure understanding of Christianity, why didn't he try to learn from them? Is, I guess, what I'm trying to ask, as opposed to saying, you know, okay, cool, like let's convert them and bring them into our situation, where he's looking at them and saying, well, they don't have to become priests to attain this level of understanding. It's a more like a simpler society in a way.
Yeah.
Maybe we should learn from that.
Yeah. So that's actually a very astute question, and more than just this context, it kind of cuts to a major question in early American studies about the things that all European colonists do in the early Americans, because like Dr. Hodorovich and I were talking about in our academic speak, you know, like one of the things that we see is that whenever Europeans arrive, they tend to look at the Native Americans as childlike versions of themselves.
Right.
And so with the religious context, I think somebody like Mendieta would look at the Native Americans and be like, we should try to be like them, but number one, we can't be, because original sin, and because we obviously have these inborn qualities of greed and lust and violence and all those sorts of things. But we need to make sure that they have the knowledge of the gospel necessary for the salvation of their soul. So we can take from their example and try to be more like them, even though we can't be like them. But also we got to make sure that they have all of the education, because if they don't have all of that Christian understanding, then they're never going to fulfill their purpose. So, it's a weird, twisted sort of colonial thing.
Yeah, I get that part. But did he then think that they did not have original sin and the greed and the other flaws that they themselves had? Because it seems like if they thought all that was on them, the whole point of Christianity was to redeem them from that. So if they thought this other group did not have those inherent sins, then I guess, like, theoretically they wouldn't have needed the salvation.
You would think so.
This is not my world,
but
like, at all.
You were asking a good theological question.
Oh, good.
And the answer is, I can't make the logic work in my head.
Oh,
because,
good.
Yeah, it seems completely foreign to me. You know, it's like it doesn't comport with my understanding of so many things. And where Mendieta goes from this, I want to look a little bit further into down the line. And when I have this is like the third time I've done this, I'm so sorry. When I have an answer, I will let you know. And I will ping you on Instagram, and then we'll go back to that picture that we took together that's in your background, and we'll talk about it over some Peronis on a Hotel
Well-
des Artistes balcony.
Yeah, we'll have a virtual chat in Pompeii about medieval stuff.
Of course.
Okay, and I saw in the chat Liz wanted to add something.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something that I think might be kind of an interesting spin-off, both to what you guys are talking about and a little bit, though not directly, to Noelle's question, which I think is a really great question about our relationship of the relationship between history and our own identity. It's so complicated, which is that a lot of mid-16th century Europeans hypothesized that St. Thomas, the apostle, had proselytized in Mexico. And they made that connection in part by knowing or believing, or maybe both, depending on who you are, that Thomas the Apostle had proselytized in India, which is something that we tend to say about St. Thomas. And there are sort of early Christian relics in India that you can visit in and around Goa. So in 16th century Europe, when Europeans hypothesized that maybe Mexico was India, which was an idea that lasted for quite some time, that of course suggested, well, St. Thomas could have been there spreading Christianity long before it was spread to much of the rest of the world. And a lot of those people went so far as to suggest or try to take apart etymologically the idea that the Aztec god, I want to say Toplitzan, but I'd have to double check it. It's not any of the big ones. It's not Quetzalcoatl. It's a more minor god. That was actually St. Thomas, if we sort of put together the pieces. And I've always found that to be really kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
And the idea of, well, if they thought that they had a purer kind of Christianity, we could refract that question in a different direction and ask, well, maybe they were Christians before anyone else was Christian almost, right? So I think it's another sort of aspect of that question, right?
Can I request that as your next research project? Because
that's Liz's research project.
There are so many interesting projects going on right now. And part of that is my research, not fundamentally, but just about the relationship between St. Thomas, India, Christianity, and the New World, that they're really all tied together. Yeah,
absolutely. Which is, again, like when I saw Dr. Hodorovich's presentation a year or so, 2 years ago, maybe. Time is relative. That, like, her talking about that context made me ask the question that ultimately became the research question that I'm presenting on tonight. So it's a nice kind of like full circle sort of thing.
I just want to jump in and say one thing really quick. So I told my students that I wouldn't keep them any longer than an hour and a half. So I was just going to cut them loose, and then we could, if you're cool, those that want to stay around and ask some questions, we could do that. How do you feel about that, Josh?
I'm absolutely
okay.
Ready to answer questions.
And then one other request we had, Josh, was posting this to your YouTube page. So is there any way you could put in the chat a link to that YouTube page?
Yes. I can. Let me plug my YouTube channel. Yes, students, your professor has a YouTube channel. If you hadn't guessed by like the green screen and everything else, I stream from time to time. So yeah, I'm a YouTube streamer. That is the weirdest thing I think I've ever said in my life.
So while you're bringing that up, I wanted to read the question that Maria had in the chat, which I think you'll find interesting. She asked, from what we know of Christopher Columbus, what is your personal opinion based on what he did and how he was as a person?
Well, I'm usually, and the link to my YouTube channel is now, I need to go to everybody. It's now in the chat. I'm not going to hold any punches. I think Christopher Columbus was an absolute monster. I think that there have been some attempts to use his religious ideology as a way to excuse or to mollify, to soften Christopher Columbus's image, but there's no way around the fact that even in this religious context, he comes to the New World, he comes to the Americas, and he immediately sees the potential for forced labor, and he takes slaves immediately. And so we can talk about Jerusalem, we can talk about, these grand apocalyptic visions, but we also have to think, what did he do? Like, what are the actions that he took? And they were violent. They were incredibly oppressive. You can read his journals, and you can read about how he gave Native American women over to his crew to rape. You can read about the people that he brought back in bondage. You can read about all of the terrible things that he did, and terrible enough that the Spanish king and queen sent a party to go collect his ass and bring him home because he was too much out of control. So,
am I remembering correctly that he used to execute people in groups of 13 because he thought it was a holy number?
I don't know. One thing we do have, and I've been as clear as I can about Columbus. One of the things we always have to keep track of when we're talking about the Spanish in the Americas is that we have the Black Legend to contend with. And the Black Legend is kind of this mythos about the Spanish being uniquely cruel. They weren't uniquely cruel. They were cruel among many cruel people. But one of the purveyors of kind of the texts of the Black Legends, Bartolome de las Casas, there are times where you're just like, are you using these depictions of the Spanish eating babies, burning people alive, like babies alive? Are you using that as a rhetorical strategy, or are you reporting as an eyewitness? And it's tough to tell sometimes. So how far we're willing to go and say, is it true that he executed 13 people at a time because he's so superstitious? Don't know. Did he execute people? Absolutely. I say very bad things about this when not in public.
Freddie has his hand up.
Yep, there you go. You're ahead.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say again, thank you. And if there are any of my students still, and you want to, stick around and ask questions, you don't get to talk to medievalists all day, every day. Please feel free. Otherwise, if you want to leave, that's completely okay. Please just follow the instructions for the extra credit. I'll stick around to keep hearing. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, my students can peace out too. I mean, they probably already figured that out. They're like, you know what? We had to listen to him a couple of other times this week. So we don't want to listen to him. I don't blame them.
With my students, I will be posting the YouTube link when Dr. Hubbard uploads it in the announcements on Blackboard. So if you want to hang, cool. If you've got to go and you want to catch the tail end of it later, that's fine too.
Same with my students. You hang around, don't hang around. We'll talk tomorrow.
Jeez, how many classes were there here?
A lot. We
Well,
give
now I feel like an interloper.
You are not an interloper. You are a special guest.
I saw your mom was here too.
Yes. Yep.
Which I enjoyed.
She's a good mom that way.
I saw her reaction when you made the comment about needing a Bible, which I enjoyed.
I didn't get to see that.
I did. She seemed to enjoy that comment.
I bet she did. I bet she did.
I did not realize that this was like 6 other classes happening.
Yeah, no, we do this lecture series more frequently when there's not a pandemic.
Yeah, once a month.
And usually we do it in person.
Yeah.
Like Jerry was saying at the beginning, it just, this was the first time we did it virtually, and like, let's just open it up, see what happens.
So a couple things I wanted to point out that was kind of going on in the chat is a lot of people found not only your presentation and the topic very interesting, but they also seem to really like the conversation that was going on between you and Dr. Rodovich about some of these other like subtopics. And so it might be something to consider of doing this, maybe we can get together with Freddie. Are you still on there, Freddie? Maybe we could put together a panel discussion on something like this.
Cool.
Sure, I'm still here. Yeah, but I'm a 20th century type of guy. I mean,
Well, I mean,
I think he was envisioning your series, Jerry, that you do. That's a couple of different scholars.
yeah.
Oh, okay, yes. Which, by the way, I have one for April. I'm just finishing tuning up a few details, but I have one for April. And by the way, I will take advantage of this moment, guys, to let you know that I was able to book Luis Astorga for May the 5th. Luis Astorga is probably the best scholar right now, in my opinion, for the history of drug trafficking in Mexico. He's pretty good. I'm really excited to have that guy on board.
That sounds great.
What I was thinking is maybe we could do this in the fall when this would be really appropriate for 1301 or, you know, maybe the first part of world history or global history. So just something to kind of think about, you know, but it seems like there was enough chatter in the in the chat box to kind of to at least this has some kind of like, you know, momentum, or, you know, there's some tentacles to follow up on this. So it's really cool. I know you probably didn't see this, Josh, but there was 128 people on at the peak of this thing.
I did notice, because, you know, I do have a vain streak, and I had to know for myself how many people were here.
All right.
But thank you for letting me know.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's almost exactly the same average we have in person. So I find that interesting. You know, I kind of thought maybe more people would be on, but, you know, over 100 people is a great turnout for something like this, I think, you know, maybe.
Awesome.
Yeah, so something to kind of consider, maybe putting together a panel on this. I don't know what that looks like. That's probably for other people to kind of talk about, but or if or not, maybe we can bring back another medievalist next year too, just for.
You know what? Something about the Colombian exchange. That would, you know.
Yeah, I think that'd be totally relevant. So something to kind of think about. I'll work with you on this, Freddie. You know, you host it, but I'll help you reach out and find some people about it.
I was gonna say, maybe Josh, you could ask Brett Whalen, since Apocalypse is his jam.
Absolutely.
If he'd be willing to do a virtual event.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Plus,
absolutely.
Josh mentioned an idea that I think that is really cool, which is how science was kind of done in the pre-scientific era, so that he could, you know, add his point of view. And maybe I have a couple of biologists that might be interested in, you know, contrasting how science was made, pre-scientific method and post-scientific method. That would be also very cool.
Cool.
One other thing I want to say real quick is Dr. Esbacher has a talk on, you're going to have to forgive me, but I think it's Tuesday. Am I correct?
Yes, Tuesday at 6:30 Mountain Time.
Yes, and actually this is really fun because it's kind of pop culture. So do you want to go ahead and just give us like the elevator plug on that?
Sure. So basically, I am going to be talking about WandaVision, Marvel's WandaVision, for those of you who've tuned into it on Disney Plus, and how it covers TV history. So particularly the history of the sitcom, because I feel like a lot of people are like, okay, like there are some things some things I recognize, like 70s Brady Bunch. Okay, like that's what they're referencing. But the show actually does a really good job of kind of playing with TV history and tropes, and it's a great way to discuss like suburban history, the American dream, TV as a medium. So we're gonna have a lot of fun on Tuesday talking about Marvel and TV. So come and join me.
Okay, do we have any more questions for Dr. Hebert and the apocalypse? I personally want to request like a lecture on the robot apocalypse in the future.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe we just talk about Mars or something. I don't know, but you know.
Yeah.
That's the next apocalypse, and we need to be, you know, we need to be aware of that, not just Sarah Connor, etc.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You know, a whole panel on Isaac Asimov would be great.
I would be highly surprised if you don't already have a talk for that ready.
I don't.
You know, Mike Duncan has done talks on Apocalypse in literature from the English department angle before. He'd be down for a apocalypse and pop culture session.
I wonder how the apocalypse is seen and understood across different religions.
Yeah, it's an interesting, a really, even within Christianity,
Right.
The apocalypse is different, because one of the things that Liz brought up, that I mentioned towards the beginning of the presentation, is that the Greek meaning of apocalypse is an unveiling, revealing. And so when you look at some of the New Testament apocrypha, these extra books of the Bible that don't make it into the canon, and you find a whole slew of different apocalypses, but they're nothing like Revelation. They're tours of the afterlife. They're like Dante's Divine Comedy. And they're moralistic texts. You know, they run through a battery of sins, and ultimately they're didactic in terms of their morality. But they're fascinating to kind of, you know, get these little bits here and there to see what people across the spectrum of Christianity. I know that there's a lot of work on Islamic apocalypticism, and there is a scholar at Rutgers her name is Maite. That's her first name, and I can't remember her last name right now. Maite Mercado, I think. And she writes about Islamic apocalypticism in the 15th, 16th century, something like that, I want to say. She gave a talk at that apocalypse symposium that I was at. And the Byzantine context is interesting. I have a book on Russian apocalypticism that I need to read. That one involves nukes. That'd be up your alley. It's 20th century apocalypticism.
That sounds great.
Apparently, the Russian Orthodox Church is starting to really say a whole bunch of things about the Russian nuclear arsenal. And that's what this book is about. Man, I don't read that around Halloween. It's scary.
Yeah, he's already pitched it for the history reading group. He's like, this should be our October book.
You have the weirdest reading list, dude.
I do.
Like, you really do.
I blame Twitter.
But I wasn't sure what to expect when I saw you post this. I was just like, oh, I want to come and see you talk because I've never seen you teach.
Yeah.
And now that I remember, I could tell the difference between Tuesday and Thursday. I came on the right day. I signed on Tuesday and I was like, why is no one here? And then I realized it was Tuesday.
Yeah.
But I wasn't really sure what this was going to involve. And I thought it was a really interesting way that the way you talked about this. But this also might be a really simplistic question.
Mm-hmm.
But when you were talking about Columbus going back on, I think it was his 4th trip,
Mm-hmm.
When he found gold. And
he found gold the whole way.
Oh, okay. He found
but
gold.
it was that specifically the Mines of Solomon.
Yeah. Right. When he was in Panama, I think.
Yeah.
Did he like legit believe like throughout his life that this was truly like this was his real religious belief?
Yes.
Or okay, because by the time you got to that point, I felt like it could have also gone to the like, I gotta justify them sending me on another trip, and this seems like a really good way to do it.
Yeah,
And
no, he was a true believer. Absolutely true believer.
I really never thought about any of it. Like there was no reason that I could connect any of this before, and it's very bizarre, but it also sort of makes some of the like present end times kind of context. I can sort of now see how it got there. But yeah, it's really weird to think that this was all happening. So many like the same mindset was still happening.
Yeah. Well, I think part of that is we're conditioned here in the 21st century to see Columbus as a clean break from the Middle Ages. Like, we don't think of him as medieval. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that gets wrapped up in our understanding of what the medieval is, which we could unpack, another time. But we want to think, or we tend to think, I should say, of Columbus as somebody modern, and in some ways he very much is modern. He's got a globe, and the way that people were starting to understand geography had changed at least a little bit. That people were starting to go away from the T and O map of just the three continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Things were, you have the, lack of a better word, Renaissance, better to call it the humanist movement, and all that stuff that moves away from these kind of medieval ways of thinking, and then at the same time also looks back at the Middle Ages and says, that was a really bad time. We hated that time. It was backwards, and no progress happened since Rome fell in 410, which, we know is not true. And so there's this kind of modern underpinning that we want to attach to Columbus. And when we start talking about weird shit like apocalyptic religious stuff, that doesn't seem modern to us. It doesn't seem modern at all. That seems very medieval, very ancient, because we want to think of the humanist movement, the Enlightenment, those sorts of things as almost being anti-religious, even though they were completely religious. But we want to see them separate. And the fact of the matter is that Columbus was not modern, but he wasn't medieval either. But we forget about the medieval parts. And so when we confront the medieval in Columbus, it causes that cognitive dissonance.
I never thought about him, like, it's interesting that you say we tend to think of him as modern. I just think I never thought about him either way. I don't think I ever really thought about what his religious beliefs were beyond the fact that he was coming from Spain, and Spain was a Catholic nation. And that was about it. So when you started going into all of this, I was like, wow, this is getting messed up real quick.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just, I don't know why I never thought about what, like, his further motivations. And it was really interesting to hear what you found in doing the research.
Thank you. It wasn't until I was in my PhD program that my advisor gave a lecture about bridging the medieval and the modern at the very end of the semester, and was like, oh, did you know that Columbus had all of this like medieval prophecy stuff? And I was just like, jaw on the floor, like, what? No. And then, I kind of put it to the back of my mind because I had a dissertation to worry about.
Right.
And then all of a sudden I'm teaching American history, and I'm like, oh wait, there was this cool like Columbus prophecy stuff. What was that about? I should introduce my students to it.
Right.
And then like I give them some of the book of prophecies without like any context, and they're like, dude, this is stupid. What are you doing?
You're like, why did you say that before I wrote the dissertation? I could have used that.
Yeah. So it was.
Shut up in case anybody has actual questions who are like actually students, because
We do have a question in the chat.
Yay.
Jocelyn or Jocelyn, I can't tell how to pronounce your name, I apologize. She writes, I think it's interesting how apocalypse in Greek meaning world apocalypse changes. I'm wondering what you think about the meaning and translation to different languages, how much that would possibly change the end times.
Well, I think that's a really actually deep linguistic question. And it's one of those things where language, and I don't want to become English teacher here, but language has cultural. And if we look at other religious systems, like let's say we look at the Hindu system, and we look at or the Buddhist system, or something along those lines. The words for apocalypse or end time, or even eschatology, which means the study of the end, or the last things would be very, very different. But that's because there are different systems of knowledge at work. So we have a very Western way of thinking about things, how we come to know things, how knowledge is understood, revealed, synthesized, analyzed, and all of that. And in other parts of the world, in let's say the East, whether it's India or China, Japan, Southeast Asia, the way they understand knowledge, its relationship to the scope of history, the scope of the cosmos, and all of those sorts of things, very, very different. So, one of the things that immediately came to my mind is in the Hindu tradition, there's a constant cycle of birth and death and rebirth and death, and the same thing works for the entire universe, where Shiva both creates and destroys. You have Shiva create, have a period of goodness. Eventually things fall in under the auspices of the goddess Kali. Kali kills Shiva, Shiva's destroyed, the world is destroyed, but then Shiva dances again and the world is made anew. So there's a certain circularity in that that's very different than how we would understand it, how we understand time in the West, because of our very attached to Christianity kind of thinking, where history has a beginning and an end, and it's just a line. Where in other cultures, it's not just a line. It's circles, or circles within circles, or circles within circles, or within circles. And you need Dr. Strange to help you sort it.
I think it's only a hardcore people that have stayed on.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this was a really good discussion. I mean, like, this had a lot of longevity, and it was really great, and and obviously, not only did it lead to a really great conversation, but I think some interesting potential research projects could be out of this. I don't know if Jordan's still on is Jordan still around? I'm just curious if you could share with us, like, what Jordan has done as part of this project.
I think she checked out for the night. She had something else to do.
Yeah.
Jordan has been a really awesome trooper, because she's not a historian. She's a science major, and she gets randomly assigned to me, and I'm like, let's talk about the Christian apocalypse. And so, like, a lot of our preparation for the run up to actually, like, getting the project off the ground and starting to look at sources and compiling some different things was really, it was cool. It was like a reading seminar one-on-one, where it's like, here, we're going to read about some crusading theory, we're going to read about medieval apocalyptic thinking, all those sorts of things, and then we started reading primary sources together. We read a few secondary sources together, and we just kind of got lost in the weeds. And so what she did was, number one, help keep me out of the thickest of the thicket, because, like, she helps keep me accountable. Like, I could have gone down that astrology path and gotten lost. But she would bring me back and be like, what is this about? Like, what are you talking about? It helped me clarify my thinking. She helped me put together all kinds of images and help source a bibliography. Like, so she got to get her hands really dirty in the historical research process. So she knows what it's like to be a historian, which I think is so.
Yeah, she worked with me on the Rosedale Farms project, and she didn't. And again, who knows about historic preservation? And so,
yeah,
I had to, like, train Jordan how to conduct these, how to catalog these homes in this neighborhood. And so she did really, really well, especially for somebody that's not even you know, a history major, or even like maybe probably not even all that interested in it like we are, she like just did really great work. And so I was curious to see like how she went from historic preservation of the neighborhood next to Villa Verde to, you know, traveling these long time and space with you. And like, you know, that's a really interesting shift for her.
Yes. And one of the things that she's written about for her blog as a part of the Melon thing is how doing this has helped her understand her Catholic faith a little bit better. And that's part of, I think, why she got drawn into this a little bit. And you know, just like, you know, we've talked about a couple times in our chats about how like reading about this part of the history of Christianity helps understand the Mass, or, you know, okay, the priest was using this piece of scripture in the homily today, or you know, I always had that question and I didn't know how to go about answering it about Christianity. So it was kind of cool to do that, and it allowed me to read some texts that I hadn't gotten to read in a while. I hadn't dove back into the Old Testament prophets in a long time, and like reading Daniel and reading Ezekiel and Isaiah and First and Second Kings, it was cool. It felt like very like connected to this this old program of study that I used to do while I was still in grad school, and then have an understudy to help was rad too. It was a really cool experience.
Cool. So one thing I want to say is I set the meeting for 2 hours and we're coming up on that.
Yeah.
So like maybe one more question and then we'll call it for the night. And then
Sure.
obviously I think we need to have Josh come back at a later date and, you know, pick this conversation up, and, you know, we'll give him free reign on what he wants to talk about when it comes to the apocalypse. So it'd be very cool.
Word.
Okay. Other questions, concerns?
Just wanted to say thank you, Josh. I really enjoyed it. One of my students actually just wrote me on Teams that she really enjoyed, and she was blown away by the lecture. So she was really, really happy about attending.
That means a lot. Thank you.
Sure.
And yeah, it's so cool to be able to share this stuff with other people. I don't get to talk about it in my own classes, you know, because we're busy talking about things like World War II and
well, I can tell you as a World War II historian, I get to mention my research in like a sentence.
Right. But you know, like at least you get to be in the ballpark. Like I get one corner of one lecture to be like, hey, I'm a medievalist. And oh, look, I know some stuff about medieval Christianity. And it's always at the beginning of the semester when not even everybody's enrolled in the class yet. And then it's like, okay, I get to give a Latin lesson every once in a while. So it's cool to be able to share like this part of my scholarship with people. It's, you know, I love American history. I've come to love American history, but this is my baby. All right.
Okay, Freddie keeps popping in and out of the screen like he's a rock star or something.
Well, he is.
He just keeps coming in.
It was by mistake. No, thank you guys. Really nice to attend.
All right,
and cool. Yeah, let's keep in touch for future presentations.
All right, sounds
right
good.
on, y'all.
Well,
I'm gonna go drink some cold water.
Yes, I need the same. I got the shot earlier and I'm feeling some weird side effects. So
move your arm. Move your arm.
Well, it's not that. It's not a soreness of the arm. I just feel like I got a cold. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah,
like body aches and stuff. It feels weird. Like I got that weird head thing, you know?
Is it your second shot or did you get Johnson & Johnson?
No, it's the first shot. I got Pfizer.
Okay.
but I think my body's running a little low because of the week that I've had. So it's not functioning. So I think that's also playing into it. So, you know, I'm just looking forward to sleeping tonight. That's just going to be awesome. So, okay. Well, thanks again. So I just want to say this one last time. This was an awesome presentation. I thought we had some really great discussion, and we had some incredible questions from everybody, not only from faculty and visiting, you know, scholars to, you know, students. Students had some really good questions. In fact, I would say that students had some questions that kind of stymied Josh into kind of thinking about